We've been following the life of Jesus for the last few years through the Gospel of Luke. We've followed him from the crib now to the cross. We're down now to literally hours before Jesus is hung on a cross. And I understand where, this is always that time of year, like, should I just do it? Tomorrow we'll do a Jesus coming into the world message, okay? That's the Christmas story. We'll look at that tomorrow, Christmas Eve. Today we're gonna stay on our journey through the end of Jesus' life. And Jesus has been tried. Remember what's happened? He was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was praying and he was betrayed by Judas. He was at that point arrested, taken into the house of Annas, which was the ex-high priest. And as he was there, he was mocked, he was beaten. And then from there, he was taken over to the house of Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, the 70, the ruling council of Israel had put him under scrutiny. They had brought him before a trial. It was there before the Sanhedrin that he was condemned to death. And in order to accomplish that sentence, they had to bring Jesus over to the Romans, who were the only ones who had the power to execute anybody. And so they've taken him now to Pilate. Pilate examines Jesus, asks him some questions, and he comes out with the verdict, not guilty. He had told him, I find no fault in Jesus. There's nothing that's deserving of death in his life. And because of the crowds, Pilate is trying to find a way not to have to give this sentence of death, but the crowds are demanding it. And so he sends him over to Herod, who was in town. Herod was the ruler over Galilee and the whole region of Galilee, thinking that he had found a way not to have to give the sentence that they were looking for, thinking maybe Herod would give that sentence or Herod would let him go. And so after Herod tries him, he sends him back to Pilate, to Pontius Pilate. And now Pilate is going to have to make another decision. Now, what's interesting in that whole passage and that whole idea is that you have the Roman leader, Pontius Pilate, who's already said he's innocent. We have Herod, who is the leader over the region of Galilee, who's already said he's innocent. And then Herod not only declares him innocent, but he mocks him. He really had no love for Jesus. He had no concern for Jesus, but he just, out of his, findings, there was nothing guilty. There was nothing deserving of what they wanted to do to Jesus. So he sends him back to Pilate and says, I find no fault in him as well. And what's amazing is for the second time, Pilate now has Jesus in front of him. And Pilate is going to have to give an account here for his stand. I really believe it's not Jesus on trial here. Not for 1 minute. You see, the one on trial was Pilate. And he's the one who's going to have to decide which side he's going to fall on, either for Jesus or against Jesus. And he's going to find out as we go through this text, there's not a neutral place to stand here. You're either going to find yourself on his side or you're going to find yourself in opposition to him. But you'll never find yourself as someone who says, well, it really doesn't matter, or I'm not a participant, or I'm a neutral participant in this decision about Jesus. You're going to have to decide whose side you're on. And I think we find that in this passage. Look at chapter 23, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23. We're going to read verses 13 all the way to verse 25, and then we'll come back and we'll expound upon those verses. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, he said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed have examined him in your presence. I have found no fault in this man concerning those things which you've accused him of. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him. And indeed, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I'll tell you there, for I will chastise him and then I'll release him. For it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. And they cried out at once, saying, Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. And Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again said to them, but they shouted, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Then he said to them the third time, What evil has he done? I find no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him, and I'll let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified, and the voice of these men of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave the sentence that it should be as they requested, and released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and for murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Again, the religious leaders are gathered outside of the house of Pontius Pilate. It would have been the Praetorium. It would have been where a guilty plea or a innocent plea would be given. But what's interesting in this whole picture is that the Jews, you notice Pilate kind of goes back in and he keeps coming back out because the religious leaders wouldn't cross the threshold of this house because they would have been defiled in doing so. They didn't want to not partake in the Passover festivities, and so rather than going into the Gentiles' house, they just kind of stand outside the Gentiles' house, and they're yelling, they're screaming, and they're crying out for Jesus' death. How hypocritical is that? They're saying, we don't want to be defiled from our religious activities, but we want this man murdered who's done nothing wrong. And it's interesting how religion can have, can take both sides of that. And, you look at that and go, man, how does that even work? You're crying out for someone's murder, someone's death who's done nothing wrong, and yet you don't want to be defiled from participating in religious activities. How ironic at this point. Remember, Pilate at this point has declared to these religious leaders, look, Jesus has done nothing wrong. Jesus is an innocent man when it comes to the accusations that you brought against him. And I really want to look at this morning and really look at Pilate, because I had mentioned to you earlier, I really do believe he's the one that's being tested here. He's the one who's really under the microscope here. He's the one who's being tried in this situation. It was Pilate who was having to make a decision about Jesus. It's interesting that Matthew tells us that he had been warned not to have anything to do with Jesus. Matthew 27:19, it reads like this: While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great dream today in a dream. I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him, because of Jesus. What an interesting event that had taken place. Pilate's wife was warning her husband about how he was going to judge in this case concerning Jesus. And she just sends him a note. It appears that he was on the judgment seat. She didn't have access to him at that point, but she has one of the other soldiers come along and say, well, look, I want you to go take this and warn Pilate for me. Tell him that I've had a dream. And we're not told what that dream was. Could it be the dream that Daniel saw as one like the Son of Man was coming? And that he was that mighty rock that was going to crush all the nations. I mean, we have no idea what that dream was. But in that dream, she knew that what Jesus was and who he was he was innocent, and that he wasn't at fault for the things that he was being accused for. And so she warns him. And yet he proceeds to give a verdict after being warned. And I just think it falls in that same category for us, guys. You see, here's the deal. When it's all said and done, when you and I leave this life and we enter into eternity, the only thing that's going to matter is what you did with Jesus. That's it. It's not going to matter how successful you were, or how many accomplishments you had, or how much you accumulated in this life, or how liked you were. You know what? The one thing that's going to matter is what did you do with Jesus? And there's people warning you, look, don't have anything to do with this man's demise or rejection, or his coming to a conclusion that would be negative toward him. And his own wife was trying to bring this to his attention. Look, be careful for Jesus. And I think it wasn't just his wife. Pontius Pilate had come to that same conclusion himself. He's innocent. He's an innocent man. I find nothing that deserving of the charges that will be brought against him. Matter of fact, one of the things we do know, if you go back to John's account of it, is that Pilate feared. He feared this decision that he was going to have to make. It's found in John chapter 19 and verse 7. I want to read this to you. It says, the Jews insisted, we have a law, and according to the law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And he went back inside to the palace, and he asked, where did you come from? And Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Excuse me. Do you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Isn't that who says that? Look, buddy, you don't have no power. The only power you have is the power that was given to you from above. And at this point, think about Pilate in his mind going, man, who is this man? Who is this guy? He don't fear me, but yet I'm fearing him. He has no concern for the power that I have to have him taken to a cross and to be hung. And yet I'm here, and the way it sounds is that he had a greater fear after he heard that he was the Son of God. And I'm convinced that there was something going on in the conscience of Pilate. It wasn't just the warning from his wife. It was something deeper than that. And he was now fearful for the decision that he was going to have to make concerning Jesus. He realizes, and he comes to the same conclusion. He says, look, this man has nothing found in him. I found nothing in him. Now, just think about, I put myself in that position. If somehow I was being tried and everyone that I've ever known was to be brought to the front and say, hey, do you have anything against them? There'd be lines. We don't have enough time for this. But here's Jesus under scrutiny. And not one thing that he ever did was brought forth that was true. Every accusation was a false accusation that was brought to him. Not one was able to be corroborated. Not one that was able to hold the water against Jesus. And it's also fascinating as you look at this text is that they're there and it's the feast day and they, everyone's aware of what's going on, that it's about time to celebrate when the Jews got delivered out of Egypt and they are brought into the promised land. So, it was great festivity taking place. And during those festivities, there was a custom that would take place, and it was called to release one of the prisoners at that time. It was a sign of the Roman government acknowledging that we're going to declare mercy for one person during the festivities of the Passover. It was something that happened on a yearly basis. And it's interesting that they're going to bring two guys to the front. It's going to be Jesus or Barabbas. And it kind of declares that they kind of have a choice. You know, here's two guys. I'm going to release one of them to your hands. Which one do you want me to release to you? One of them's a murderer. One of them's actually caused insurrection in the city. All the things that Jesus is being accused for, Barabbas actually did. There's an interesting passage in the book of Leviticus chapter 16, and it's probably where they got this idea of releasing someone during the Passover. It's Leviticus chapter 16, verse 7, and I thought it fits the bill perfectly. Leviticus 16, 7, it says this: "You shall take the two goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots for the two goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it, and let it go as a scapegoat into the wilderness." What an interesting picture. What an interesting picture in light of what's just transpired in the life of Jesus. You see, there was two goats that were presented. One of them, the Lord's, what was to be the offering for sin, and the other, the scapegoat, was to be set free. It was all done by lot. And what's fascinating in this picture is that is being played out between Barabbas and Jesus. One of them was going to be the offering for sin. The other one was going to be set free. And we have before us, I believe, in Leviticus chapter 16, another prophecy fulfilled, another picture that was given to us in the Old Testament that would declare what was going to happen in the life and the ministry of Jesus. They all cried out, "Get us Barabbas. Let us have Barabbas. You know, we want Barabbas. What do you want to do with Jesus? Crucify him." And so this whole picture plays out. Now, you know, what irony, right? What an incredible picture here, that the very same people, or even if not the very same people, the same crowd, same groups of people that were present were the ones a week earlier that were declaring, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," and they were acknowledging him as the Messiah. And it wasn't here not even a week down the road, that they're saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." It's also ironic that Barabbas embodied the seditious spirit in which Jesus was falsely accused of. You see, if you wanted anybody that they were confident, they were sure was causing a ruckus, and someone who had committed murder, and someone who was guilty of the consequences of crucifixion, it would have been Barabbas. But instead, they choose to release Barabbas and to crucify Jesus. Barabbas, literally his name means son of the Father. And they're going to release someone who's called son of the Father, and they have the son of the Father right in their hands, and they're going to crucify him. What a picture. Such irony here. And then you realize that the one that was innocent goes to the cross, and the one that was guilty gets set free. And guys, that isn't an accident. It's not an accident. The innocent went to the cross, and you and I, the guilty ones, set free. That's God's grace on display. Because if anyone was guilty, it's me, it's you. And yet he's going to take upon himself the sins of the whole world. And so you have played out before us this whole picture. If you go back to verse 20, remember, it's Pontius Pilate who's in every attempt to let Jesus go free. It's Pontius Pilate, not the religious leaders. It was Pontius Pilate who's trying to, intercede, trying to, put cover for Jesus. I find nothing wrong with this man. I find nothing guilty of death. Then why would he condemn him to death? He knew in his heart. He even acknowledged it to the Jews on 3 different occasions. He's done nothing wrong. Why would he make that decision? And I would come to the conclusion that it was his own future that he was concerned about. It was political correctness that caused him to come to that conclusion. We're told, again in John's Gospel, chapter 19, he was being threatened by the Jews. They would tell him this. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." And here was the threat by the Jews. Look, Jesus claims to be a king, therefore he's a threat to Caesar. You let him go, then we're going to report back to Caesar that you're not looking out for his best interests, and it would have been a threat to his power. It would have been a threat to his position. It would have been a threat to his lifestyle. It would have been a threat to his job. You see, everything that he saw valuable and important, it would have threatened all of it. And so he decides, rather than standing for what I know to be true, I'm going to compromise what I know to be true. And it's really easy for us to see that in Pilate. He becomes an incredible picture for us, an incredible model. Like, man, someone that's willing, because of expediency, because of his own interests, because of his own desires, he's willing to say, you know what, I would rather see Jesus crucified than lose my position. But how is it when you look in a mirror and you realize that I have to make that decision all the time? Am I willing to stand on what Jesus declares in spite of the consequence of doing so? Do I really believe that what Jesus says is true? Am I willing to compromise that truth because of my job, or because of my position, or because of my power, because of some friends or some relationship that I don't want to hinder or to lose? We all got to ask that question, every one of us. You know, you're in the same boat that Pilate's in. What are you going to do with Jesus? What are you going to do with him? What decisions are you going to make in your life that are going to, have a consequence, that are going to have eternal consequences? Do you think about what Jesus said? And when I just kind of break it down, Jesus proclaimed some very simple truths. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no man comes to the Father except through me. If Jesus is the way, he's the only way. It's emphatic. Jesus said, I am the way. That's telling us that there's only one way to God. He says, I am the truth. What that declares is that there's only one truth that a person can live by. There's not multiple truths. There's not, that whatever's true for you isn't true for me. There's one truth. He's the truth. He's the life. And just in case you didn't understand that, Jesus says, and no one can come to the Father except through me. You see, Jesus is very emphatic in what he declares. The truth is very clear in what he says. And then we have to be put in this position like, is there, someone asks us, well, is there more than one way to God? And we're just like Pontius Pilate. We got to declare, yeah, there's only one way to God, or no, there's many ways to God. And we're all put in the judgment seat, right there. Do you really believe what Jesus says, or do you don't believe what Jesus says? Do you really declare that what he says is true, or you don't declare what he says? There's only one truth. There's not multiple truths. There's not what's true for you is fine for you, and what's true for me is fine for me. That's not what Jesus said. And then you and I got to wrestle with that. If Jesus says that's truth, then it's either I'm going to line my life up with it, or I'm going to betray it for the sake of my own pleasure, my own expediency, my own comfort, so that I don't lose my job, or I don't. You see, guys, you and I are walking through this life, and we're the ones on trial, not him. It's already done. He's already sitting at the right hand of the Father. He's already won the battle. And one day he's coming back again. And when he comes back again, man, he's going to take his bride with him to heaven. And then 7 years are going to happen down here. It's called the Great Tribulation Period, or the Tribulation Period. The last 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation. And it's going to be a time where God's wrath is going to be poured out upon the world. And the Scripture all declares this stuff. It's just as sure as you and I are here today. It's going to happen. And you and I got to come to that same conclusion, man. Am I going to deal with the truth that's been declared to me, or am I going to reject the truth that's been declared to me? And the thing that amazed me about Pontius Pilate is that Pontius Pilate knew what the truth was. He knew Jesus was innocent. He knew that the Jews had an ulterior motive of jealousy that they had brought Jesus, and yet he's going to give way to it anyway because it was convenient. It was expedient for his own purposes to do so. And I think as you look at this passage, it's really easy to come to that same place that Pilate was. Because Jesus didn't just declare that he was the way, the truth, and the life. He backed it up. He backed it up by fulfilling over 300 prophecies concerning his life. 300 prophecies fulfilled from the Old Testament. Where he would be born, how he would live, where he would live. It declares, what his life would look like, how he would die. And many of those prophecies not even possible to fulfill, outside of God having his hand upon it. How do you determine where you're going to be born? And yet the Scripture tells us that Jesus will be born in Bethlehem. The Scripture tells to us the very day that he'd come riding in on the colt. Daniel lays out for us, the very day that Jesus would declare himself the Messiah and enter into Jerusalem. It would have been just a short, less than a week before these events are taking place. And all of it foretold hundreds of years before it ever happened. How does that happen? He backed up his claims by prophesying, by prophecy, by the fulfillment of those prophecies. He didn't just back up the claims by the fulfillment of his prophecies. He backed up those claims by living the perfect life. No one can bring an accusation against him because he hadn't sinned. There's an interesting passage in John chapter 8 and verse 45, John chapter 8 verse 45, it says that Jesus says, because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? And if I tell you the truth, why do you not believe me? What's interesting, Jesus goes, look, which one of you has anything on me? Which one of you can convict me of sin in any way? No one. They were silent at that point. Because Jesus had never sinned. Can you imagine? 33 and a half years and never once sinned. Just like the Scripture foretold. He backed it up by the fulfilling of prophecy. He backed it up by living the perfect life. And then he backed it up by the fact that he was willing to die on the cross for sins. It was before they ever came into Jerusalem. Jesus says, let me tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to be arrested by the chief priest and the leaders, and then I'm going to be handed over to the Gentiles, and they're going to mock me, and then they're going to kill me. And then the third day, I'm going to rise again from the grave. Before Jesus ever entered into Jerusalem, he knew what his fate was. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And he went into Jerusalem in spite of it all, because he came into this world to die for the sins of the whole world. And he backed up the claims that he was making. And not only did he back up by being willing to die on the cross for our sins, he backed it up by rising from the grave on the third day. You want to talk about a feat. Go and claim to be the Messiah and to have power over death, and then be killed, and then rise yourself up 3 days later. You see, Jesus didn't just say it, he did it. He didn't just claim it, he proved it. And as you're looking at all of these things, you realize that he promised that one day he's coming back again. And because he's fulfilled every other promise, he backed up every other claim he's made. Now you and I can have assurance, and we can have confidence that because he fulfilled all the other promises, that he's going to fulfill the next promise. And one day he's coming. One day he returns. And I'll tell you, man, the more, the crazier our world gets, the more division we see, the more animosity toward Christianity we're watching, the more I anticipate and I expect and I wait for his return. What's interesting is the end of that passage. He says he handed them over to do their will. He delivered them to their will. He releases Barabbas according to their will. And Pilate gives in to the crowds rather than standing for the truth. He gives in to the crowds rather than standing for what he knew, his conscience, his wife, his everything in him, what was he screaming at him. He was trying to please everybody rather than what he knew to be true, his own conscience. Guys, and I think that's a warning for all of us. Man, we can fall into the same trap, man. We can fall into the same trap. That we're more concerned about what family thinks or what friends think. We're more concerned about, some relationship. And for some, it's just I don't want to let go of some pleasure I have, or some sin that I don't want to let go of. And because I want to hold on to those things, I'm willing to not let Jesus be the Lord of my life. I'm willing to deny him. You see, just when we started out at the beginning, you got to choose. You're either for him or you're against him. There's not a neutral place when it comes to Jesus. And Pilate's going to find that out the hard way. You see, there's coming to a point here where I want to focus in on Pilate on one more instance, and it's found in Matthew chapter 27. I'm going to ask you to turn there. It's the 24th verse. Matthew chapter 27, verse 24. It's the same account that you and I are looking at here, but Matthew gives us some details that Luke doesn't give us. And it's here that Pilate attempts to clear his conscience, and he attempts to clear his guilt. Notice what happens in Matthew 27, verse 24. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and he washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. And he released Barabbas to them. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And somehow in Pilate's mind, he was thinking, you know what? I'm going to be the neutral party in this whole thing. I'll take the bowl of water, I'll wash my hands in front of everybody and say, look, I'm guiltless when it comes to the life of Jesus. But you can't do that. You can't be a neutral party when it comes to Jesus. You're either going to choose for him or you're going to choose against him. And Pilate chose to hand him over to be scourged, to be killed on a cross when it was in his power not to. And that will be the deciding factor when it's all said and done for every one of us. You have all the facts, all of the evidence is out there for you to discover, for you to look up. Everything been declared about Jesus. You can come to a conclusion in your own life. Is Jesus going to be the Lord of my life, or am I going to choose to do something else with my life? Is he going to be the master, the one who I surrender my life to, the one who calls the shots in my life? And really, when someone calls them their Lord, what you're declaring is that you're the one who has the authority over my life and over the decisions that I make, over the course of the life that I take, that what I've done is I've surrendered my will over to your will. That's what it means for you to ask Jesus Christ to be your Lord. And you and I have that choice. Or you can say, well, because of my own desires, my own wants, my family, my friends, my mom, my dad, my brothers, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my husband, my wife, I'm not really going to make that decision to surrender everything over to him. And you put yourself in the same place that Pilate, even though you have all the evidence that he's worthy of it, that you decide, you know what, I'm not willing to do it. Because it's an inconvenience. Because it doesn't line up with my agenda. And Jesus here is going to be handed over to be crucified. He's going to be handed. Next week, we're going to get into the cross, man. And what an incredible picture as we start to look at the brutality of what took place as Jesus is handed over. And they literally beat him to the point where the flesh on his back was being ripped out. And it looked like just a mess, just a hamburger meat by the time they were done with Jesus. And then he gets a wooden beam, the cross beam on his back, and he's going to carry it up to Mount Calvary. And there on Mount Calvary, he'd be nailed to a cross. And he did it all because of his love. He became the sacrifice, the lamb. I find another interesting picture. Whenever they were going to bring an offering to the temple, what would happen before that animal was ever able to be offered here, they would take, a priest would come and they would begin to inspect that lamb to make sure it didn't have any spots, it didn't have any blemishes, any deformities in that lamb. It had to be a perfect sacrifice. And I think Jesus, who's about to be the Passover lamb, is being inspected by the priest and the world. And he's found to be innocent when it's all said and done, and yet condemned to death. He went through great scrutiny, examined, on multiple levels. And no one can find anything wrong. Is because he was the perfect sacrifice and yet condemned to death. I want to close with one passage, and it's found in the book of Hebrews chapter 9. And let me ask you to turn there. Hebrews chapter 9, I think it kind of puts that whole picture for us there in the 26th verse. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundations of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, He has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this is the judgment. So Christ offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Isn't that a great verse? Once at the end of the ages, he offered himself for the sins of the whole world, for the sins of many, is what Hebrews tells us. And what you and I deserved, Jesus took upon himself. Here's the reality of it all. I'm Barabbas and you're Barabbas. We're the guilty party. We're the murderer, the thief, the rebellious. And in our place, Jesus paid the price. That's love, man. That's a love that I can't even fathom, because it wasn't just, it'd be one thing if it was just a man who said, I'll die for you, but it was God incarnate, this perfect one, the sinless one who died for me and for you. And as we celebrate this week, we're about to gather together with family and friends, and we're going to celebrate Jesus coming into this world. And I think sometimes we kind of picture Jesus in a manger. You kind of little cute little Jesus, you want to pinch him a cheek. I don't know if you guys saw the news article, the little girl that went in and took Jesus home because he was out in the cold all night, and she didn't want Jesus to be out in the cold another night. We kind of got this picture, sweet little baby Jesus. No, Jesus came into this world to die. He did it for you. He did it because he loved you. He was sitting in the throne room of heaven. And he humbled himself and became a man. And he bore upon himself your sin, your shame, your guilt. And all he's asked is that you would acknowledge that sin, confess your sin. And he would forgive you. And by his blood, atone, pay for the sins that you've committed. It's an incredible picture. And we see all of it play out in Pontius Pilate, man, falls right into the trap that so many fall into. That they would rather turn their back on Jesus because there's some pleasure or some success or something that they're not willing to give up.